Hey, welcome back to the channel. My name's Justin. So I love large electronic drums. The sizes are correct, so you have that muscle memory. They look awesome, and you get the weight of a large wooden shell that you just don't get from a smaller 8-inch plastic shell. The problem is, it's freaking expensive. So one way to get around this is to build one yourself. But before we start, let's cover who this is not for. If you expect to build something on your very first try that'll be just as good as a VAD 706, that's probably not going to happen. And it especially won't happen if you buy cheap components like a lot of people do. This is a time sink. Just like, building your own custom PC or building whatever by yourself, you're going to run into a bunch of tiny little problems that you didn't see coming. This video, though, is built from the ground up to try to help you speed run most of those problems and get up and running as fast as possible with something that just works. So step one is buy a shell pack. I recommend checking out Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist. This is one step where you can spend less money because it won't have any impact on the final conversion. You can take any acoustic drum shell and turn it electronic, but if you plan on using the type of triggers that go inside the shells, there are some edge cases you should probably avoid. Piccolo snares aren't great because internal triggers end up being too tall to fit inside. Also, if your shell has dents or an internal bevel, that's not a great choice either, because the triggers can't lay flat on an uneven surface. And finally, your life will be much easier if you don't buy shells that have hardware poking past the inner shell wall. A tell is if you can see one of these dome-shaped washers on the inside of the drum. I've had issues with two separate metal snares because most trigger brackets are too narrow to go around that type of hardware. In general, I found that wooden shells cause the least number of problems. But of course, at the end of the day, you can find workarounds for any issue that you come across. Okay, so the next step is buying a set of mesh heads. So starting off with 1-ply mesh heads, you should probably avoid these. A lot of people love buying the Remo Silent Strokes or the Evans Sound Off heads because you can buy a whole set of them for under $100. They're under $100 because they're not that good. They're very, very thin, very lightweight and springy. And also because there's not a second stabilizing layer, there's a lot of bad triggering that goes on with 1-ply mesh heads, meaning that you have to use more aggressive trigger settings than a more premium option. And by the way, there's also a subcategory of mesh heads that are just a very, very dense, thick 1-ply. These feel amazing. The problem is they're much more expensive and they're incredibly loud. So no matter what, 1-ply mesh heads just aren't that good. So the next type of mesh head are the 2-ply mesh heads. These have a heavier feel, better trigger accuracy, and all companies use it. Simmons uses it, Yamaha uses this type of mesh head, Roland uses it, Gava uses it, Millennium, just everybody uses 2-ply mesh heads on electronic drums. And then finally, we've got the last category, 3-ply mesh heads. 3-ply mesh heads have the potential to feel a little bit more dense, a little bit heavier than 2 or 1-ply heads, because they have that third layer of material. That's why I like them. The problem is, it's hard to say all 3-ply mesh heads feel like this, because they don't. This is an older Jobecki mesh head, before the new generation they came out with, and it basically feels like a 2-ply head because the material is very, very thin. So you kind of have to go on a case-by-case basis, watch some reviews before you end up buying anything with 3-ply because you can't assume it will feel a certain way just by looking at photos of it. So at the moment, my favorite 3 kinds of mesh head brands are the Roland Power Plies, the Drum Tech Design Series, and the Drum Tech Real Feel line. So next up, rim silencers. So silent. It's almost like I'm not even hitting this drum. You can purchase it by the foot, meaning that you cut off individual pieces for each drum, or you can buy them in a complete circle. And if you're feeling really cheap, you can even make your own. Go to your local home improvement store and buy some rubber hose from the plumbing section. This method definitely works, and I tried it once for a video a long time ago, but to be honest, I wasn't personally impressed with the results. Okay, so the next step is to buy a set of triggers that you install onto your drums to turn it into electronic. There are 2 main categories. You have the clip-on triggers, and you have the ones that go inside your shells, which I'm going to call internal triggers. The clip-on triggers are very enticing to new electronic drummers because the install is instantaneous. The problem is, if you play with these long-term, you'll start to notice gradually that your responsiveness isn't quite as good as a regular electronic drum set. There are 2 types of people that might find these useful though. Let's say you only need something for 6 months. It's a temporary electronic drum conversion. This is a better option for that kind of person. The second kind of person that will find these useful is what they were actually designed for. This is made to put on acoustic drum heads. If you go this route, I recommend the Roland RT30s and the D-Drum high-end ones like the Chrome Elites. Alright, so let's move ahead to internal triggers. I've tested a pile of different brands, as you can see right here, but that's not even close to all the companies that exist. Here's a list of the ones I'm aware of split by continent. You probably don't want to pay overseas shipping rates and import duties, so this list should help you buy from companies local to you. Let's cover a couple of options from each area to help kickstart your research into what to buy. That doesn't mean the other brands I don't mention are bad, these are just my favorites out of what I've tried. Starting with the North American market, Convertible Percussion is an incredibly beginner-friendly brand. It's an all-in-one system with both piezos, the foam, and wires pre-attached to an aluminum frame. This made the install pretty streamlined. You can adjust the head piezo up or down with this post, and side to side via the built-in track. Weirdly enough, this is a side-mounted center design, but it can't go all the way to the side because the track just isn't long enough. There are a few things that I wish were different about this design though. The bracket uses screw holes, which I'm not really a fan of. You can't slide the whole system up or down until you hit the correct height, like most other companies let you do. Instead, you have to raise or lower the post until you hit the correct height. This requires using 2 sets of pliers to tighten down the bolts, which was kind of awkward setting up in a smaller shell. Also, the wires can be a little bit finicky. But taken as a whole, this is a great beginner system that doesn't cost that much and is very easy to set up. Next up is UFO drums. I like this brand the most out of the two for several reasons. The parts are incredibly heavy duty. I have no worries about the internal shifting around if I throw this into the back of a car. But the real strength of UFO drums is how much customization they give you if you want it. You have the ability to choose the size of the piezo, the type of trigger foam, you can pick between 3 types of input jacks, and the rim piezo mount. As you can see, I accidentally bought both versions of the rim sensor. The triggering is excellent, even on a 16-inch floor tom. UFO drums isn't completely flawless though. This trigger system does look kind of ugly compared to the competition. Also, the number of options you have to tick off on the website might be a little bit intimidating to a newbie electronic drummer. And the trigger system comes in pieces, at least mine did. I had to attach the piezos, the trigger foam, and wire everything to the input jack. I mounted the clips in the wrong place at first, and they stuck to the input jack so strongly that I ripped one of the cables by accident trying to remove it. But aside from my initial setup struggles, if I had to just start all over again, I would buy a whole set of these triggers. They work great, they're heavy duty, and they're affordable. The only downside is that it's kind of ugly and it takes longer to set up. Now let's move over to the European brands that I've tried, my favorites out of that bunch. R Drums is the highest end trigger company that I've tested. It's not cheap, but if you want the best, you should check out this brand. They're really well designed, the frame is sturdy, extremely high grade trigger foam is used for low latency, and the guy who makes everything tests the polarity of every single head piezo he uses. That's some next level attention to detail. The second one is Jobeki. This is a decent budget option that works pretty well while keeping the price tag down. Jobeki offers side-mounted and center-mounted trigger designs in a bunch of different configurations at different price ranges. They also offer mesh heads, fully converted drums if you don't want to do the work yourself, and a whole set of cymbals. Okay, so moving ahead to the kick drum, I want to cover some of the ways of going about converting one of these. First of all, you have method 1, using a very thick mesh head because you want to get that weight and that sort of resistance when playing on this large of a playing surface. And then you want to get a nice trigger system on the inside. So method number 2 is getting something with a pad. In this case, I've got a Roland KD-822 conversion package. So this is essentially a Roland KD-10 that is put inside of an acoustic Mylar drum head. It's just bolted onto the middle of that drum head. There's a large difference between the feel of a mesh head kick drum and a pad design like the Roland KD-822. Mesh is more bouncy, allowing you to play faster. I also want to mention it's very possible to create your own DIY KD-822. I haven't personally tried it, but all you really need is a standard electronic kick drum pad and mount it inside your kick drum. In fact, I've even seen a guy use a standard rubber pad that he mounted upside down from the tom mount inside of his kick drum. So another method that I've tried is from a company called Alternate Mode. They make this kick drum sensor that looks like a kick drum patch with wires running through it. Instead of using piezos, it's using a technology called FSR. So you have to play exactly on the patch, and if you play slightly off it, it doesn't pick up anything you're doing. This means this sensor is immune to crosstalk. And then finally, the last way of converting a kick drum that I want to cover in today's video is not converting the kick drum at all. Instead, you put the sensor on your kick drum pedal itself. So you're using a mesh head, and then whenever you press down on your footboard, it comes in contact with the piezo sensor. This type of trigger is mostly used by metal drummers. I'll link to an excellent video from 66 Samus if you'd like to learn more about the pros and cons of the major brands. So the next step is to buy a whole set of cables for your drum set. They need to be at least 8 to 12 feet long. Also, these cables need to be stereo, or else you'll only get one zone working with each pad that you use. And finally, you got to make sure it's angled on one end. You'll find out real fast that cymbals can't even connect unless a cable is at a right angle. I don't have a big, strong opinion on what cables to buy. I personally just like Hosa cables off Amazon because they work reasonably well and they're cheap. But if you want to spend even more money, you can get some fancy clear cables from Drum Tech, or even get custom-made cables with, gold tips and all this sort of stuff from different companies online. By the way, I also highly recommend buying a headphone extension cable. Depending on your setup style, the module might end up kind of far away from your headphones, so an extension cable that goes from male to female will put less strain on you. So the next step is purchasing a box to plug all your drums and cymbals into. You should pick this first before shopping for cymbals to avoid compatibility problems. There are 3 categories to choose between. You can purchase a drum module, a trigger interface, or an audio interface. Let's go through the pros and cons one by one. So if you choose to use an audio interface, you'll need 4 separate things. An audio interface big enough to handle all your pads, a laptop, a plug-in to turn the audio into MIDI notes, and a second plug-in to turn the MIDI notes into drum sounds. The reason why most drummers don't go this route is that it takes more work to set up, and it's expensive. You'll need 2 regular-sized interfaces or 1 massive interface with 12 quarter-inch inputs. There are just better options out there. Option number 2 is to buy a trigger interface. This is a step in the right direction because it will turn the pad audio into MIDI notes for you. No separate trigger plugin required. The Alesis Trigger I/O and the ddrum DDTI are the most popular choices as far as dirt cheap trigger interfaces. The problem is, I don't really recommend either of those because they don't have enough zones for most people to fill a whole drum set with dual zone and triple zone pads. I would personally look at the eDrum N10, and I believe alternate mode also made a pretty nice trigger interface that could work if you want to go this route. And then finally, option 3, the drum module. It's an all-in-one device, no extra equipment is required. It does MIDI out and drum audio simultaneously. You can also plug in more drums and cymbals into the average drum module than 99% of interfaces. Depending on what you buy, you'll also get direct outs, faders, sample import, a built-in headphone jack, a mix input, and the confidence that you have knowing it won't crash. Even a drum module from 2012 has a lot more going for it than a standard trigger interface. There are 2 weaknesses though. Affordable drum modules don't have good built-in sounds, so you might still end up needing a laptop. And secondly, new drum modules are expensive. That's why I recommend buying a used one. As far as what brands to buy, avoid anything from this list. These are cheaper companies that don't spend very long designing their drum modules. They might work fine with the pads they come with, but they don't always have some of the more advanced trigger settings that you'll probably want. My go-to recommendation is just to buy a roll-in module that fits your budget. There's also plenty of other good brands as well. I really like the Yamaha DTX Pro and DTX Pro X modules. The built-in sounds are top tier for that price range. Check out this tutorial to see how to make the newer Yamaha modules work with mesh pads. But just keep in mind, if you do decide to go with Yamaha, you are kind of limited on what cymbals you can buy without third-party adapters. Okay, so the next step is buying or making a set of cymbals. Electronic cymbals come in 3 basic types: metal, electric low volume, and rubber. Let's cover metal cymbals first. This type of electronic cymbal feels great and looks incredible, but on the downside, they're very, very loud. You can mitigate this by putting rubber pads where you strike, but in my mind, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of buying them in my opinion. Another downside is that metal electronic cymbals are very heavy. In fact, they're even heavier than acoustic cymbals. That's because they start off with an acoustic cymbal as the base and then put even more weight in the form of dampening on the bottom. As of right now, your main option is field drums. Coming soon, Extreme Drums will also be making some as well, but they're not currently listed on their website. And then finally, I was going to mention Joe Becchi because they've been making full metal cymbals for a very long time. But if you take a look at their website now, it looks like they're sort of moving away to rubber cymbals and low volume cymbals instead. So next up we have electric low volume cymbals. These are basically Zildjian LEDs, but with triggers on them. I love how thin and flexible these cymbals are. When you dig into a crash hit, they flex like an acoustic cymbal. This means that playing on them will be easier on your hands long term versus metal or even rubber cymbals. I also like the fact that they don't weigh too much, and they're way quieter than regular metal cymbals. But I do want to mention that because this cymbal vibrates a lot, you'll have to use more aggressive trigger settings than on a standard rubber cymbal. If you decide to go this route, you have a ton of different companies to choose from. Joe Becchi, Diamond Drums, Pintec, Magnetrack, Gear Drum, Go eDrum, and Extreme Drums all make these. Now, if you're a hardcore DIY person, you could also just make a set of low volume cymbals yourself. Pick up some low volume cymbals dirt cheap on AliExpress and buy a set of triggers. Right now, there's 3 companies that I know of that make a set of triggers like this. The first is Magnetrack. They sell individual piezos with built-in cymbal mounts. From what I can tell from their official videos and project page, They do not sell a triple zone ride cymbal yet, so I wouldn't go with them if that's something that you need. The second option is Extreme Drums. They say in their manual that they do sell a trigger system for metal and low volume cymbals, but currently it's not being shown on their website yet as of the making of this video. So I assume it's something that's in the works that's just not quite out yet. And then finally, we have Go eDrum. There's a couple of really great video tutorials by the channel Project Beats, where he walks through how to create cymbals step by step using Go eDrum triggers. I highly recommend checking it out. Okay, so that's how you can go about making your own cymbal. But for me personally, I'd just rather buy cymbals that are already made. It's less of a hassle, and I didn't get good results a few years back when I tried to make one myself. But I do respect anyone who takes the time to go make one themselves. And then finally, we have rubber cymbals. I like rubber cymbals the most because they kind of just work. They sound the least annoying to people around you, and the triggering is the best there is, depending on the brand. Now, as a warning, cymbals are going to be the most expensive part of your drum set, so you'll want to be careful with your budget here. If the budget is tight, cheap out on the crashes. You can grab some cheap Alesis style cymbals, or if you're feeling a little bit more adventurous, hit up AliExpress. I've tested the Lemon brand of cymbals, and they perform surprisingly well for the price. But when it comes to your hi-hat and ride, I recommend getting the good stuff. Those are the two cymbals that you hit the most. You need them to be up to snuff. Here's a list of the very best cymbals that I know of in different sizes. Now, as a quick warning, if your drum module has two ride cymbal inputs labeled bell bow and bow edge, you need to buy a ride cymbal that also has two ports as well. This list of cymbals is designed for that kind of module. Okay, so the next step is buying a whole set of cymbal stands. Thankfully, you don't have to buy any sort of proprietary Roland official cymbal stand or Alesis official cymbal stand. Anything from Tama, Gibraltar, anything will work. But I do want to warn you, you may need to purchase some anti-rotation stoppers for the kind of cymbals that you end up purchasing. They may or may not come in the box alongside them. Let's talk about drum module hardware. You have two basic options. You can buy a dedicated module stand or buy a module clamp. Getting a clamp from Alesis or Gibraltar will take up less space on your drum set, and it makes setting up your drum set and tearing it down if you're mobile very quick. But I've found it's not a good option for those who have larger, heavier drum modules, and it can unbalance a stand. And personally, I don't like seeing my module shake around while I'm playing. If you want to get a dedicated stand, they range from $80 to $200 each. Roland, Gibraltar, Pearl, and Tama all make stuff that would work. But what if you don't want to spend, $150 or $200 on an official drum module stand? It turns out they're incredibly easy to make on your own. All you need is your drum module and an old cymbal stand. So this is a Yamaha cymbal stand. I just removed a bunch of different segments from the top of it until I found something that fit my drum module mount. Okay, so next up, let's talk about how to install a trigger system inside of an acoustic drum shell. They come in all different shapes and sizes. You've got bar triggers like this, you've got side-mounted triggers like this Joe Becky one and this Extreme Drums one. And then finally, you have the monster trigger systems that are really expensive that have an arm that goes to every single lug. It doesn't really matter what they look like, you kind of have to install them all in the exact same way. Now, a trick that I've found to make my life a whole lot easier, because hardware always falls out the moment you start removing screws, is I put a piece of tape like this. It holds it in place so I don't have to have a magical third hand while I'm trying to do the install. So the next question is, how high should the trigger system go up? The general rule of thumb that I've heard from various different trigger companies is roughly about 2 millimeters above the bearing edge line. Also, make sure the trigger system is firmly in place. Tighten down all the screws, because if you don't tighten them down, this system will slowly, over time, sink further and further down. When that happens, it will lose contact with the mesh head, and you'll notice that your triggering becomes very, very weak, and you have to keep hitting harder and harder. The next step is getting a cable from your module over to the trigger system. This can be a little bit tricky depending on the kind of shells that you have. On this one from Extreme Drums, I've got a little cable going from 1/8 inch out the air vents, and then I've got the receiver jack right here that will connect over to the drum module mounted right here. Meanwhile, with this convertible percussion shell, the air vent is large enough. I've modified it to be a little bit larger, so I've got the output jack right there, and I can connect a wire on the other side. There's also a couple of other workarounds that I know of if you don't want to go either of these routes. You can take an old beat up acoustic head, cut a small hole, a little bit smaller than this, and then put it basically as your resonant head and feed the cable through this. Another method for people that use individual stands is to route the cables through the mounts of your kick drum and high toms. Once all this is done, the last thing that I do before putting the mesh head on is throw some fabric on the inside of the shell for sound dampening. This means you can save money by leaving your acoustic resonant head on. The fabric keeps the head from ringing out. Or you can buy a full set of cheap 1-ply mesh heads for the resonant sides to keep an even look. It's up to you. And finally, the last step, which I think can be the most difficult one if you're new to electronic drums. You need to give yourself a few days to adjust the trigger settings. The cymbals are easy. Where things get tricky is setting up the drum triggers. I can't tell you the exact numbers for sensitivity, threshold, and rim head adjustment to put inside your module. There are just way too many trigger and mesh head combinations out there to give you any sort of hard numbers. Each company will have their own settings they recommend that you use. But even if you follow them exactly, I can almost guarantee you'll still be fiddling with the settings here and there for a few days at least until you get everything to a place where you're comfortable. Okay, so now that you've seen the whole process, you should have a pretty good idea whether or not this DIY approach is for you or not. If it feels like you'd rather get something pre-built, that's completely fine, and here's a list of different options and different price ranges. But for those of you that really do like the idea of building a kit from the ground up by yourself, now you have the tools to get started. That's the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in a few.